There's a lie people tell about the frontier. They say it made men hard. It didn't. It made them quiet, which is a different sickness altogether. I've buried 9 people in this valley. I've watched a man lose 400 head of cattle in one night and say nothing but well. I've seen a woman deliver her own child on a wagon seat with the reins still in her teeth. But I never saw anything like the night Ellis Rohn went hunting for a wife, with 6 hours left on the clock. He wasn't looking for love. He wasn't even looking for a woman, not the way a man does. He was looking for a signature, a name on a line, something to hold up in front of a judge at sunrise so they wouldn't take his little girl away from him. And he found her standing in a laundry shed at 2 in the morning with her sleeves rolled past her elbows and lye burns up both forearms. A Chiricahua woman the town called Delphina because they were too lazy to learn anything truer. He offered her a roof. She asked him one question. One. And I have thought about that question every single day for the last 31 years, and I still don't know if I'd have had the courage to answer it. Let me tell you how it went. The rain came down like it had a grudge. I remember that first before anything else, the sound of it drumming on the wagon bed, a flat mean hammering, and under it the softer sound of Wren breathing in her sleep beneath the oilcloth. 6 years old, curled up like a question mark. She had a broken pewter spoon clutched in her fist, the handle bent double because it had been her mother's, and because she wouldn't sleep without it, and because Ellis had long since stopped trying to explain to her that dead people don't come back for their silverware. Ellis was up on the box beside me with his hat brim pouring water into his lap. He hadn't spoken in 11 minutes. I know because I counted. That's a thing I do, I count, I tally, I write it down. Got a little green cloth ledger in my coat pocket, been carrying one version or another of it since I was 19. Weather, egg counts, what day the first frost hit, how many cigarettes I smoked. It's a stupid habit and I'm aware of it, thank you kindly. That night I wrote, rain hard from SW. Ellis has not spoken since the Fenton's Gate, 2:04 in the morning. God help him. I did not write down what we were doing. I found I couldn't put it into words that didn't shame us both. Here's what we were doing. At sunup, in the back room of the Cochran County Courthouse, which was really just the front room of a feed store with a flag nailed over the grain scale, Judge Ambrose Pike was going to sign a paper, and that paper was going to take Wren Rohn away from her father and hand her to her great-aunt Vesta Hollies of Prescott, a woman with a mouth like a purse clasp and black kid gloves she wore even at supper. Vesta had filed the petition 11 weeks prior. I'd read it. It was 2 pages, and it was polite in the way a rifle is polite, and the heart of it was this. The minor child resides in a household absent of feminine influence, care, or moral supervision. That's the phrasing, absent of feminine influence. Marion Rohn had been dead 14 months. She died in April with the cottonwoods just going green, of a fever that came on so fast that by the time anybody understood it was serious, it wasn't serious anymore, it was finished. Ellis had held her hand. Wren had been in the next room, and somebody, it was me, was supposed to keep her occupied. And I did. I made shadow rabbits on the wall for 2 hours while a woman died 8 feet away, and Wren laughed at the rabbits. I still don't know what to do with that memory. It just sits there. Some things don't dissolve. Anyway, what Vesta Hollies knew, and what the judge knew, and what Ellis knew, was that the law in the territory was not friendly to a widowed man of 34 running 400 acres alone with a child in the house. It didn't matter that Wren was fed. It didn't matter that Ellis had taught her to read out of a Montgomery Ward catalog, and that she could name every bird in the wash. What mattered was the shape of the household, and the shape was wrong. Judge Pike, to his credit, hadn't wanted to do it. I watched his face that afternoon in the feed store. He was old and he was tired and he had a boil on his neck that he kept touching. He said, and I remember this exact, "Mr. Rohn, I am obliged to consider the child's circumstance as it stands. If the circumstance were to change, I would be obliged to consider that instead." And then he took out his watch, and he looked at it a long moment, and he said the thing that put us on that wagon in the rain. I depart on the 8 o'clock stage. That was it, that was the whole of it. 6 hours and change, if the circumstance were to change. Ellis started at the top of the list, which tells you something about him. The widow Coyle, out on the Bitter Creek Road. 41, 3 grown sons, ran her late husband's place better than he ever had. She met us at the door with a lamp and heard him out, and to her everlasting credit she didn't laugh. She stood there with the lamp shaking a little, and she said, "Ellis, you're asking me to marry you by dawn." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Because of the girl." He said, "Yes, ma'am." And she looked past him at me and then out at the dark, and she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "If you'd asked me last spring when it was just asking, I'd have said yes." Then she shut the door. Not hard. That was the worst part. She shut it soft, like closing a door on somebody sleeping. Then Miss Ada Farrow, the schoolteacher, who did laugh, a short, shocked bark, and then she put her hand over her mouth and apologized for the rest of the conversation, which was mercifully short. Then Nell Sykes at the boarding house, who said she'd do it for the North Pasture and $100, and Ellis said he didn't have $100, and she said, "Then the pasture and your saddle horse." And Ellis stood there in her front hall with rain running off him for a full 10 seconds and then said, "No," and walked out. I asked him about that later. Why not? It was a fair price for a daughter. He said, because Wren would have grown up knowing what her mother cost. Then he threw up in the ditch behind the boarding house, quiet, holding onto a fence post, and I stood there and looked at the sky and let him have it in private. That was 1 in the morning. We found Delphina because of the lamp. Everything in Cochrane was dark by then, dead dark, the kind of dark where the town isn't sleeping so much as it's absent. But behind the Ochoa place, back where they took in washing for the mine, one window was lit, yellow and low, and Ellis pulled up the horses without saying anything and just sat there looking at it. I said, "Ellis." He said, "I know." I said, "Ellis, that's the laundry." He said, "I know, Toby." And I thought about the woman who worked in it, and I thought about what people would say, and I thought about Vesta Hollis's black gloves, and I thought about Wren asleep behind us with a bent spoon in her fist, and I did not say another word. He climbed down. The mud took him halfway to the ankle. He straightened his coat like he was calling on somebody at a Sunday social, and I nearly wept, and he walked to the door and knocked. I should tell you what the town knew about her, which was almost nothing, and most of that wrong. They called her Delphina. That was a Spanish name, and it wasn't hers. It was one that had been hung on her somewhere along the road between where she started and where she ended, the way you'd hang a tag on a crate. She was Chiricahua. She had come off the San Carlos reservation 4 years earlier with a paper from an agent, and she kept that paper folded in a tin snuff box, and she could produce it faster than most men can draw. She had too. She'd been asked 11 times in 4 years. I know because she told me once much later, and the fact that she knew the exact number is the thing that broke something in me. She was maybe 30, could have been 25, could have been 40, work and son and grief do arithmetic on a face that nobody can undo. She had a white seam of scar across the back of her left hand, thumb to wrist. Her forearms were mottled to the elbow from old burns layered over new ones, a topography of them. She spoke English carefully, like a person setting down something breakable. She spoke Spanish when she was angry and Apache when she thought nobody was listening. And once, only once, I heard her singing in it low, over a wash kettle, and I stood outside the door like a thief and listened until she stopped. She had buried a husband, she had a sister dead, she had a nephew. None of us knew about the nephew yet. That comes later. She opened the door with a laundry paddle in one hand. Not a weapon exactly. Just a 2-foot length of wet ash which she happened to be holding, and she didn't hide it, and she didn't raise it. And she looked at Ellis Rohn standing in the mud in the rain at 2 in the morning, and her face did nothing at all. That was the thing about her. Her face did nothing. It wasn't blankness. It was cost. It was a face that had learned at some specific price that showing things was expensive. "Ma'am," Ellis said. "It's 2 in the morning," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Nothing good happens at 2 in the morning." "No, ma'am," he said, "I suppose not." And then he stood there, and the rain came down, and he had rehearsed this 5 times that night, and it had failed 5 times, and I watched the whole apparatus of it fall apart inside him, and what came out instead was the truth, unarmored, in the plain voice of a man who has run entirely out of clever. He said, "They're taking my daughter in the morning because there's no woman in my house. I have 400 acres and a good well and $106. I don't have anything else. I'm asking you to marry me before sunrise, and I know exactly how that sounds." The paddle didn't move. Behind me in the wagon, Wren shifted under the oilcloth and made a small sound, the way children do. Delphina heard it. I saw her hear it. Her eyes went past Ellis, out into the dark, to the wagon, to the shape of the child under the canvas, and something happened in her face, not a lot. A tightening at the corner of the mouth, less than a flinch. She said, "Bring her inside. She'll get sick out there." That's how we came to be sitting in a laundry shed at 2:30 in the morning, drinking coffee out of tin cups, while the rain hit the roof, and Wren slept on a folded pile of somebody's clean bedsheets with her boots off. The place smelled like lye and wet wool and mesquite smoke. There were 3 kettles and a cast-iron stove and lines strung wall to wall with other people's shirts hanging like a congregation of the beheaded. Delphina had a stool by the fire and a needle and a sock she was darning, and she darned it the entire time we talked, which I understood later was not rudeness. It was the only way she could stand it. Ellis laid it out, all of it. The petition, the aunt, the judge, the 8 o'clock stage. He didn't dress it up. He didn't tell her she'd be doing a Christian thing. He told her the terms like a man reading a bill of sale, because he decided somewhere in the last hour that the only decent thing left to him was to not lie. "You'd have the front room," he said. "There's a door on it and a bolt on the inside of the door, and I'll hang the bolt myself tomorrow so you can watch me do it. Nobody comes in that room. Not me, not ever, unless you say. Needle in, needle out. You'd have the household money, all of it. I'll show you where it is, and you can move it wherever you want and not tell me. Needle in. The work's hard. I won't tell you it isn't. Cattle and a garden if you want one, and Wren. Needle out. After a year," Ellis said, and here his voice did something. "After a year, when the court's satisfied and Vesta's given up, if you want to be gone, I'll give you the money for the train, and I'll write you whatever paper you need, and I'll swear to any lie you like about why you left. You'd be free of it. You'd be free of me." The sock, needle, fire popping. And I sat there with my coffee going cold in my hands, and I thought, he's just described a prison and offered her the key with it. And I thought about how in his whole grieving, decent, stupid life Ellis Rohn had probably never once considered that a woman might not want the key, might want something else entirely, might want to be asked rather than offered. Delphina finished the sock. She bit the thread. She turned it right side out and folded it and set it on her knee and looked at it for a while. Then she said, "Why me?" Ellis opened his mouth. Nothing came. "You went to the Widow Coyle first," she said, "not a question. And the teacher, and the one at the boarding house." Ellis said, "How do you?" "Because I'm the laundry," she said. "I'm where the town's clothes come. I know when the Fenton's boy wets the bed, and I know when Mrs. Sykes has been drinking, and I know that you are the 4th door tonight." She said it flat. "No bitterness. That's what got me. There should have been bitterness. So, why me?" And Ellis Rohn, who had spent 14 months not saying anything true out loud to anybody, said, "Because you're the only one left." I want to be fair to him. He said it, and then he heard it, and I watched him go gray. "That's not," he started. "It is," she said. "Ma'am." It is, she said, and the flatness cracked just slightly just at the edge, and don't make it worse by dressing it. You've been honest for 10 minutes. Don't quit now. The rain, the shirt swaying. Wren, on the bedsheets, turned over and said something in her sleep. It sounded like no, but it wasn't anything. Delphina looked at her a long time. Then she stood up and she went to the stove and she poked at a fire that did not need poking, and with her back to the whole room she started to talk. Not to us particularly. To the stove. She said in 81 they moved us. My mother walked. She was old and she walked 90 miles, and at the end of it a man with a ledger asked her name and could not spell it, so he wrote Maria, and that was her name after that in the book forever. She died a Maria. Poke, poke. I was a girl. I thought they have taken her name. I was angry for years about the name. Isn't that a foolish thing to be angry about? There were bigger things. Ellis said nothing. Good man, he knew enough to say nothing. My sister was called Rosalia. That was not her name either. Poke. She's dead, fever same as your wife 2 winters ago. She set the poker down. She turned around. And she looked at Ellis Roan the way you look at a horse you are deciding whether to buy, right in the teeth. No apology, and she said, Mr. Roan, in a year or 5 years or 20 that child is going to be a woman, and she's going to sit down across from somebody and they're going to ask her about her people, about her mother, and she'll say my mother died when I was 5, and then they'll say, but who raised you? The fire cracked. And I want you to tell me now, she said, before there's any paper, before there's any judge, before you owe me anything and I owe you anything. What does she say next? Nobody moved. Does she say my father married an Indian woman so the county wouldn't take me? Delphina's voice didn't rise. It went quieter, which was worse. Or does she say a name? She waited. Because I'll do it, she said. I'll stand up in front of your judge in the morning and I'll sign what you want signed, and I'll be your feminine influence. God knows I've done worse for less. But I want to know what I'm going to be inside that house at the end of it. And there's only one man alive who knows the answer. And he's sitting in my laundry with mud on him at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then she asked it, the question, the one I've carried 31 years. She said, when she asks you who I was, will you have to think about it first? I have replayed that moment more times than I can count, and every time I notice something else. I noticed that Ellis's hands were shaking, and that he put down the coffee cup so she wouldn't see it, which meant she saw it. I noticed that Wren was awake. That's the part that took me years to admit. She was awake, on that pile of sheets, with her eyes shut and her breathing gone careful, 6 years old and already fluent in the art of pretending to sleep while adults decide your life. I know because when Delphina said when she asks you who I was, Wren's hand closed on that bent pewter spoon so hard the knuckles went white. And I noticed that Ellis Roan, who was not a fast man, not a clever man, a man whose great gift was that he mended what he broke and showed up when he said he would, did not answer. He sat there. He sat there for what felt like a full minute, and it was probably 20 seconds, and the rain went on, and the shirt swayed on the lines like people waiting, and I watched a man look directly at the size of what he'd come here to do. He had come to buy a signature. He had come to a woman whose mother's name had been erased in a ledger by a man who couldn't spell, and he had asked her to sign a book. And she had just asked him, in the plainest words available, whether he intended to erase her too. He opened his mouth. Delphina raised one hand, the scarred one, barely. No, she said, don't, not fast. She picked up the folded sock. She set it in a basket with the others. She was so calm. She was so terribly, terribly calm. You have until sunrise, she said. So do I go stand outside and think about it, Mr. Roan, and when you know, come back and knock. And I'll open the door either way. Ellis stood up. He was a big man and he stood up like an old one. He got as far as the door. He put his hand on it. And behind him, small and very clear from the pile of clean bedsheets, Wren Roan said, Papa, I'm awake. What he said at sunrise. Here's a thing I've never told anybody, and I'm 71 years old, so I suppose the statute has run out. The day Marion Roan died, I was sent for the doctor. The short way to Cochrane is past the Delgado place. There was a dog there. Not a dog now, a dog then. A big yellow thing that had come off a chain and gone strange, and it had taken a piece out of my calf the previous fall, and I had been afraid of that stretch of road ever since in a way I never admitted to a living soul. I took the long way. It added maybe 20 minutes. The doctor was out on a call anyway. He'd have been too late by an hour regardless. I have been told this by 3 different men including the doctor himself, and I have never once believed them, and it does not matter what is true because the thing lives in me at the exact size it wants to live. I say this now because when Ellis Roan walked out of that laundry shed into the rain to decide what he was going to be for the rest of his life, I followed him, and I stood next to him in the mud, and I said the only useful thing I have ever said to another human being. I said, Ellis, don't take the long way. He turned and looked at me like I'd spoken Chinese. I said, I'm asking you not to take the long way around it, that's all. And after a while he said, Toby, I don't know what that means. And I said, I know, but you will in about 4 seconds. Wren was standing in the doorway with the yellow light behind her. 6 years old, barefoot on a laundry floor, night dress and a man's coat over it, hair like a burned haystack and that spoon. She said, are you going to marry the lady? Ellis went down on his heels in the mud so he was under her, looking up, which is the only decent way to talk to a child about something enormous. He said, I don't know, sweetheart. She said, why? He said, because I asked her wrong. And Wren considered this with the terrible gravity of the very young, and she said, then ask her right. He didn't, though, not that night. That's the part where the story refuses to be a story. He went back in and he stood dripping in front of the stove and he said, I can't answer your question, not the way you deserve. I don't know who you'd be in my house because I don't know who you are because I never once thought to ask before tonight and I've had 4 years to do it. You've washed my shirts. I never asked your name. Delphina said nothing. He said, so I'm not going to stand here and promise you a place in my daughter's mouth. I'd be lying, and you'd know, and you'd have to live in a house with a man who lied to your face on the first night. He took his hat off. He'd forgotten to take it off the whole time, and he did it then, which was the most Ellis Roan thing that ever happened. He said, but I'll tell you what I can answer. If you come, I'll ask. Every day, until I know. And when she's grown and she asks me who you were, I won't have to think about it because I'll have been thinking about it for 20 years. Delphina looked at the floor. Ellis said, that's the best I've got. I'm sorry it isn't better. And she said, sit down. And she went to the shelf above the kettle, and she took down a tin snuff box, and out of the snuff box she took a folded paper that had been folded so many times it was furred at the creases, and she did not unfold it. She held it. She said, my sister had a son. His name was Chizo. He was 9 years old. He had been taken to the Indian school at Fort Grant 11 months before, and Delphina had been to see him twice, and both times they had let her stand in a yard while he stood on a porch, 60 feet away, in a wool uniform in July with his hair cut off, and both times she had not been permitted to speak to him because the boy was not to be confused. She said all of this in that flat voice, the one that cost so much. She said, I have written 11 letters. 9 came back. 2 did not, and I don't know what that means. She turned the folded paper over in her fingers. They will not release a child to an unmarried woman who does laundry. She looked up. They might release him, she said, to a married woman on 400 acres with a good well. Silence. Then Ellis Roan started to laugh. Not a good laugh. A cracked, awful, wet-eyed laugh. The laugh of a man discovering that he is not, in fact, the only person in the room who came in with a knife, and being so relieved by it that his knees nearly went. He said, "You." "Yes." "You were going to ask me." "Yes." "Tonight." "Tomorrow," she said. "Sunday, after church when you were soft." He put his face in his hands. "But you came first," she said. "And you came badly, and you asked me to sign a paper as though I had nothing in the world of my own to want." Ellis lifted his head. "So I'll ask you now," she said, "the same as you asked me. Plain. Mr. Roan, will you put your name to a boy you have never met, in front of a judge who does not like you, in a territory that will make you pay for it in ways you cannot presently imagine? And here it is, the heavy thing, the thing I've never been able to make anybody understand who wasn't in that room." He didn't hesitate. "I want to lie and say he did. I want to say he weighed it, because that's what a wise man does, and I loved him and I want him to have been wise." He said, "Yes." She said, "You should think about it." He said, "You said not fast, and I thought about mine for an hour, and I got it wrong anyway. I'm going to do this one fast and get it right." They were married at 6:20 in the morning, by a justice of the peace named Otho Crandall, who did it in his nightshirt with his suspenders down and his wife holding a lamp. And it took 90 seconds, and there were no flowers and no rings, and the bride's forearms were burned to the elbow, and the groom had vomit on his boot from a ditch behind a boarding house. Wren held the spoon in one hand, and the hem of Delphina's skirt in the other. I signed as witness. My hand shook. I wrote Tobias Wren, and then I wrote the date, and then, because I am who I am, I wrote the weather. Otho looked at that and said nothing. God bless him. Judge Ambrose Pike arrived at the feed store at 7:40 with his collar undone and a poultice on the boil, and Vesta Hollies was already there in her black gloves. And when she saw the three of them come through the door together, the man, the woman, the child between them, her face did something I have thought about ever since. She wasn't angry. For about half a second before she got it locked down, Vesta Hollies looked relieved. And I understood, way too late, that she had never wanted the girl either. She'd wanted somebody to do something. She'd been 11 weeks trying to make a man wake up, in the only language the territory understood, which was paper. She said, "Well," 2 syllables of it, "well." Judge Pike read the marriage line. He looked at Delphina a long moment over his spectacles. He looked at her burned arms, which she did not hide, because she never hid them, not once in her life. He said, "Mrs. Roan." And she said, "Yes." And that was the first time anybody had called her that, and I saw her jaw go tight, and she did not cry, and I turned around and looked at a shelf of horse liniment for a while. The petition was denied. It took 4 minutes. The stage left at 8. And at 8:10, standing in the mud outside the feed store in the first sunlight anybody had seen in 3 days, Ellis Roan said, "Fort Grant. How far?" Delphina said, 2 days. He said, "Then we ought to start." They didn't get him. I'm sorry. I know how a story is supposed to go, and I'm telling you it didn't go that way. They rode 2 days. They spent $40 they didn't have. They stood in an office with a flag in it while a superintendent with kind, tired, useless eyes explained that the boy Chise enrolled as Charles Grant, and I have never in my life wanted to hit a man the way I wanted to hit a man I never met, had been transferred east 18 days previous. Carlisle, Pennsylvania, 1,600 miles. There was a form, there was always a form. It could be filed. It would take months. It might not work. The superintendent said he'd seen it work twice, and I believe he was telling the truth, and I believe he thought that was a comfort. Ellis Roan stood in that office and asked, in a voice I'm told was very quiet, whether there was a train. And Delphina put her hand on his arm. Her hand, the scarred one. And she said, "No." He said, "Delphina." And she said, "There is a girl at home who is 6 years old, and she has lost one mother this year. And I am not going to teach her, that the second one leaves. She said it standing up straight in a wool coat in an office with a flag in it, having just been told that the last living piece of her sister was on the other side of the continent with his hair cut off, and a name that wasn't his. She filed the form. She wrote the letters. She wrote one every month for 6 years, and she taught herself a better hand to write them with, and Wren helped her with the spelling of the long words, and Ellis paid the postage out of the household money that he had promised her and never once counted. That's the part nobody puts in a story, because it's slow and it doesn't resolve. She was my friend for 31 years. I never learned her true name. I want to be clear about that, because I could give you one here and make this tidy, and she would come out of her grave and take the pen out of my hand. But once, this was maybe 2 years on, a summer evening, Wren 8 years old and getting long in the leg, I came around the corner of the house for a bucket and I heard them on the porch. Wren was asking about the wash kettle song, the one in Apache. She wanted to know what the words meant. And Delphina said, "It's a song for a person's name." And Wren said, "What name?" And there was a long pause, and the crickets going, and the sun about halfway down. And she told her. She said it low, just once, and Wren repeated it back wrong. And Delphina laughed. I'd known her 2 years, and I had never heard her laugh, and corrected her. And Wren got it right the second time. I stood around the corner of that house with an empty bucket in my hand, and I did not breathe. And then I went back the way I'd come, quiet, and I did not take the bucket, and I never told either of them I'd been there. And when I got out my little green ledger that night, I sat with the pencil over the page for a long time. Whether I wrote clear, warm. I didn't write the name, it wasn't mine. Ellis died in 1907. Delphina in 1911, in the front room with the bolt on the inside of the door, which he'd hung the first morning like he said he would, and which she never once used. Wren buried them both, and she is 51 years old now, and she lives in Tucson and she has a son. Last spring she wrote me a letter, and inside it was another letter, a very old one, brown at the folds, that she'd found in a snuff box in her mother's things. It was from Carlisle, dated 1893, and it was a list of names of students transferred or discharged that year, and it was 3 pages long, and about halfway down the second page somebody had drawn a line under one of them. Charles Grant, 18, discharged to. And the rest of that line is gone. The paper's torn there, or worn through at a fold, and you can't read it, and there's no way now to know whether the tear was an accident, or whether a woman with burned arms sat at a kitchen table one night and worried at that line with her thumb for 20 years the way you'd worry a stone. Wren wrote at the bottom of her letter, "Uncle Toby, do you think she ever knew?" And I have been sitting here for 3 days with my ledger open and my pencil out, and the lights going, and the rain's coming again from the southwest, same as it did that night, and I keep starting to write back to her. I keep starting. Because the thing is, I know what Delphina would have wanted me to say, and I know what's true and